Hello and welcome to Mystery Monday number 6, the end of a mythophile. With today's Mystery Monday, as with every Mystery Monday, we are going to work specifically on our inferencing skills. And at the end of today's lesson, you will be asked to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 4 regarding your ability to accomplish those inferencing skills. So let's take a look at what that 1 through 4 looks like. Our learning goal today is to cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support an analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text, including or the text leaves matters uncertain. And remember that when we make inferences, we are able to take what we know, for example, what the text says explicitly. These are things that are very clearly stated, and we are able to bring those together, account for those things, and make a logical leap. And with that logical leap, we're drawing a conclusion, right? Based on this and this, I can logically say this, right? That is the inference that we're making. So bringing together different pieces of evidence, and it's almost like an educated assumption, right? It's a logical leap, drawing a conclusion, making an inference. And so, as I said at the end of today's lesson, you'll be asked to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 4. If you rate yourself a 4, that means that you can draw inferences from the text, identify the evidence that the author uses to prove his or her point, and you're able to identify where the text leaves matters uncertain. You're also picking up on nuance, like sarcasm and irony. If you're at a 3, that means you can draw inferences from the text, identify the evidence that the author uses to prove his or her point, and identify where the text leaves matters uncertain. A 2 means that you can draw inferences from the text and identify the evidence that the author uses to prove his or her point. And a 1 means that you are unsure of how to draw inferences. A couple things of note here before we move on. Number 1, notice that 3 is quite similar to our learning goal. The reason for that is because we'd like everybody to at least be at a 3. The wording is very much in line with the learning goal. If you're at a 4, that means you're going above and beyond, and that's awesome. If you're at a 2 or a 1, that doesn't mean that you're sort of quote unquote behind. It's actually more for me. You're telling me what I can do better. If you rate yourself a 2, and I would sort of concur with that, that means that I know that I need to do a better job of, maybe it's close reading or asking better questions to help you make those logical leaps and thus draw those inferences. So there's no shame in rating yourself at a 1 or 2. We'd like to get everyone to a 3 by the end of the year, but a 1 or 2 helps me to help you. So before we get started, one thing that I do want to make you aware of is that this story will test your knowledge of Greek and Roman mythology. So here we go. The end of a mythophile. The contents of the mansion of Everett Ashley Woodstock, the late Everett Ashley Woodstock, ran the gamut from the exquisite, the tasteful, and the rare, to the worst and absolute schlock. Everett Ashley Woodstock had spent a lifetime obsessed with mythology. Not all mythologies, however, not the meaning of mythology in history, or the art, or in the art, or in literature, but simply a total and exclusive devotion to the stories, characters, and artifacts of Greek mythology. The combination of this passion and his considerable wealth meant that Woodstock's pieces of genuine Greek statuary, particularly those sculpted before 600 BC, were unmatched by all but a few major museums in the world. The same was true of his collection of Minoan pottery. In fact, there were some wags in the Department of Archaeology at the local university who were known to observe that the Minotaur, if he ever came back, would likely have felt more at home in Woodstock's solarium than in Crete itself. But there was another side to the Woodstock experience. As though to counter the exquisite beauty with which he had surrounded himself, this eccentric old man had dipped into the vulgar and cheap, with a passion that outdid his artistic sense. For every genuine piece of sculpture from the Mediterranean, there were 2, 3, or even 4 huge and ugly plaster of Paris statues of the Greek gods or the Greek heroes or of the many virgin victims of Zeus. Each delicate face was overwhelmed on all sides by a gargantuan Ariadne or a puffy Chloe, or an ample-bosomed but vicious Phaedra. Chief Inspector Lawrence Darby contemplated this contradiction as he stood in the foyer of the Woodstock mansion, trying to stay clear of the bustle of the homicide unit doing its job around him. But the body of old Woodstock, so brutally murdered, had been cleared away and the coroner had left, but the blood, sticky now, still covered the floor, and the photographers and lab technicians continued to comb the place, searching, dusting, photographing. Chief Inspector Lawrence Darby knew they would be here for a long, long time if every piece had to be checked. In the foyer alone, there were 7 life-size statues, each representing a principal character in the gruesome story in the House of Atreus, and another set showing Jason and the Argonauts. Over in the archway knelt an obsequious Paris, holding a huge golden apple. "Must have taken a few tons of plaster for that one," Darby said to the photographer, who had just taken a third shot of Paris's bare bottom. The photographer looked up quickly. She was embarrassed. "I didn't see you, Chief," Kennedy said, to get pictures of everything from every angle. "So, did Kennedy tell you to get some shots of that broken display over there?" Lawrence Darby wanted to know. Someone, probably the killer, could not tell junk from glass. "That vase left behind in the case looks Minoan to me." Kennedy was Detective Bernard Kennedy, newly promoted, recently assigned, and perpetually and painfully eager. He was out in the solarium trying to begin an inventory of the Woodstock collection. The photographer was hustling off to shoot the display case when Detective Kennedy suddenly materialized beside a statue of Thyestes that was painted amateurishly in a garish red. "You should see the stuff in there, Kennedy. Or you should see the stuff in there, Chief," he blurted as soon as he saw Lawrence Darby. Kennedy always seemed to talk extra loud around his boss. It made Darby feel just a bit older than he was. "There's all kinds of broken cases." Detective Kennedy didn't slow down easily once he got excited. "And some of those big statues, I guess they were just too big for the killer to carry on. You should see this one. Damocles. Damocles," Darby corrected. "Yeah, Damocles." There was no stopping Detective Kennedy. "He got this giant sword over his head hanging from the ceiling yet. And these guys, Damien and Pythias," Darby managed to get in. "Yeah, Pythias," he smirked. "Wonder what those 2 guys had going." Darby felt weak. They are a wonderful symbol of true friendship, nothing more." "Didn't look like that to me." Kennedy paused for a second to bring a large plastic bag out from behind Thyestes. "Anyways," he continued, "we're gonna have a lot more trouble tracking down all that pottery than fingering the killer. Here's the piece de resistance." Darby ignored the pronunciation. "I hear there was a message left by Woodstock. This it?" "Yeah, we found it right beside him." Kennedy held up a sheet of newspaper. "See, look it, printed in his own blood. Venus. With his own finger, too. Must have." Darby looked away. He hated the sight of blood. Kennedy wasn't finished. "And here's your killer." He held out an engraved, ebony-handled riding crop. The initials TFW were very clear. "This is what we found behind the statue of Venus over there. There's blood on it. Or I miss my guess. But it's the old man's, too. Anyways, TFW has got to be Terence Frederick Woodstock. That's the old man's nephew. Find him, and I'll bet it's a case closed." Darby paused a moment or two to let his young subordinate wind down. "Detective Kennedy," he said, "I think you're looking at a frame-up, a clumsy one, too, I might add." "What do you mean?" Kennedy was indignant. "It's plain as day. The old guy writes a message in his last seconds. He uses his own blood. He couldn't possibly—" "If I may," Darby raised his voice to Kennedy's decibel level for the first time, "you, young man, have an obvious gap in your classical education. Unless it's filled, you're probably going to arrest the wrong person. So the question is, what did Lawrence Darby note that Detective Kennedy seems to have missed?" All right, before we get too far into asking questions, I want to talk about a few things. What we know. This could also be termed what the text says explicitly. Ashley Everett Woodstock is dead. His murder is being investigated. Get that all the way on the screen. He liked mythology, but one thing of note, and it says this explicitly at the end of the first paragraph, not all mythologies, however, but simply a total and exclusive devotion to the stories, characters, and artifacts of Greek mythology. So he knows a lot about Greek mythology, and they go in depth, kind of explaining how much money and time he had spent collecting. There were a few museums that had the collection that he did. So there's one other thing that I'd like to point out before we go back and answer the questions. In Roman mythology, Venus was the goddess of love, sex, beauty, and fertility. She was the Roman counterpart to the Greek Aphrodite. However, Roman Venus had abilities beyond the Greek Aphrodite. She was a goddess of victory, fertility, and even prostitution. And now for a bit of close reading. The section that I'm about to reread for you should explain everything that you need to know to answer the final question. It says, Darby ignored the pronunciation. I heard there was a message left by Woodstock. This is it. Yeah, we found it right beside him. Kennedy held up a sheet of newspaper. See, look it, printed in his own blood. Venus, with his own finger, too. Must have. Darby looked away. He hated the sight of blood. Kennedy wasn't finished. And here's your killer. He held out an engraved, ebony-handled riding crop. The initials T.F.W. were very clear. This is what we found behind the statue of Venus over there. That's blood on it. Or I missed my guess. But it's the old man's, too. Anyways, T.F.W. has got to be Terence Frederick Woodstock. That's the old man's nephew. Find him, and I'll bet it's case closed. So question number 1 says, based on the emphasis the author places on it in the first few paragraphs, what can we infer about Greek mythology? Question number 2, on page 36, Darby corrects Kennedy's pronunciation. What does that suggest about Kennedy's maturity and knowledge? Question number 3 says, there is always a cue for readers that acts as a turning point in the story. What is it here? And then the last question. What did Darby note that Detective Kennedy seems to have missed? And here is your solution. Everett Ashley Woodstock's devotion to Greek mythology was exclusive and total. Chief Inspector Lawrence Darby might have been suspicious in any case of such a clumsy frame-up. The fact that the message said Venus and not Aphrodite convinced him. Woodstock would never have used the Roman substitute for the Greek name. So now that you have seen the solution, what would you add to your final question that you didn't the first time? how did that information change what you would write? So for question number 1, based on the emphasis the author places on it in the first few paragraphs, what can we infer about Greek mythology? Well, that Woodstock cares about it exclusively. He would never choose to write the Roman substitute, right, of Venus rather than Aphrodite. Question number 2 on page 36, Darby corrects Kennedy's pronunciation. What does this suggest about Kennedy's maturity and knowledge? Well, it simply suggests a lack of understanding and immaturity, maybe a lack of thoroughness. And this shows up in how quickly he wanted to try to convict TFW, the nephew, without proper follow through and due diligence, so to speak. And 3, there is always a cue for readers that acts as a turning point. What is it here? What's when Darby heard that it was Venus, and he kind of knew the difference between the Roman and Greek gods and was able to identify that. So that is the turning point in the story. And one last thing before we wrap up here today. Here's our scale of 4, 3, 2, or 1. I would say unless you are able to decipher the difference between the Roman gods and the Greek gods, if you knew that, along with all of the other pieces, identifying the evidence and drawing inferences and where the text leaves matters uncertain, that would be the only way that you could rate yourself at a 4, because that sort of fits into that nuance category, right? This isn't to say that you couldn't have, especially after the what we know portion, started to make some of those connections. If you were able to answer the final question after seeing the what we know section of the video today, you could rate yourself out of 3. If you didn't really make that connection, but after talking it through and seeing the final answer, the final solution, you kind of went, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get where that's coming from. Then you're kind of at a 2. And if you're still not sure, please rate yourself at a 1. Again, not an issue to rate yourself at a 1. Just simply helps me to help you in the future. And so upon completion of this last question, you have earned your unit for today.